But Entity Framework and Visual Studio offer another option, creating a conceptual model of the domain and building the database from that model, instead of the other way around. This is called Model-First Design, and with its support, Entity Framework has expanded the kinds of applications and scenarios that you can use it with. Yet another option is Code-First Design, where you create your domain objects first, which makes Entity Framework even more versatile. I'm not going to cover that option here. Focus here is on Model First. Now, strictly speaking, Entity Framework has always supported Model-First Design in the sense that you could build an entity data model from scratch within the designer, or from the raw XML, or in the raw XML. But until version 4, it lacked a crucial feature, the ability to create the data store, storage model, and mapping model from the conceptual model. With support for these features added to the tools in later versions, Model First becomes feasible and even a robust option. The Generate Database from Model option is available for the designer to let you create the scripts to generate the database objects from your model. But it's important to understand that this is all it does. It doesn't actually create a new database, nor does it actually create any of the objects. It creates the script, and then leaves it up to you to execute the script. So there's going to be one additional step for you to perform, but otherwise all the hard work is done for you. This option also creates the storage and mapping models for you. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a very simple conceptual model to support a simple, very, very simple event registration system for sled dog sports, including mushing with teams of from 4 to 16 dogs, and ski joring with teams from 1 to 3 dogs. Ski joring is a very fun sport where the ski jorer, or sometimes called musher, but more often ski jorer, is on cross-country skis and is directly attached to the team of dogs, 1 to 3 dogs, although I've ski jored with 4 dogs, which is quite a fun experience, very, very fast, fun experience, not for the faint of heart. But I find ski joring much more fun than mushing because I'm out there getting exercise as well. I'm not just standing on the runners of a sled, even though sometimes in sprint mushing, you kick from the back of the sled. You're kicking the sled forward to help the team. With ski joring, I'm skiing hard back there, so it's fun and great exercise as well. Now, races normally require knowing the names of the 1 or 2 lead dogs for mushing events, but not all of the other team dogs, again up to about 16 dogs. But normally they do record the names of all the dogs for ski joring, because again it's only 1 to 3 dogs. So here's a representation of what the model is going to look like. The event entity is going to have basic information about the overall event, which will consist of 1 or more races. So for example, here in Fairbanks, in March, we have the Limited North American Championships, which consists of ski joring events, as well as mushing events for various ranges of dogs. So a single event is the Limited North American, and then races within them are different races based on really the number of dogs as well as the distance. So each race will have 1 or more entries, which are teams that consist of a musher and 1 or more dogs. Both the race and team entities have a dog count property. For a race, it's the maximum number of dogs that are usable in that race, and for the team, it's the actual number of dogs in the team, which can be less than the maximum set for that race. So if the race is an 8-dog race, I can go out there with 7 dogs. Then the team entity is a base object inherited by either a mushing entity for races where a musher stands on a sled, or a ski joring entity for races where the ski jorer is on skis attached to the dog team. Entity Framework can readily handle inheritance relationships like that. The mushing entity has properties to record the name of the 1 or 2 lead dogs, and ski joring has room for up to 3 dog names. Ski joring also records the number of leaders, which can be from up to the number of dogs in the team, depending on the tow line configuration that the ski jorer uses. Now keep in mind that this exercise is intended to demonstrate some of the model-first features in Entity Framework, and is not necessarily an example of robust database design. Don't take this as a template for your own sled dog sports event management system. Entity Framework is equally facile at supporting good and bad design. The entities that I'm going to create here come nowhere close to being sufficient for a real event registration system, but it is sufficient to demonstrate model-first design, including Entity Framework support for inheritance. All right, I'll start by creating a new console application. That'll be the container for this. C# console application, and I'm going to call this sled dog event. And put it in a convenient location. And there's this console app. All right, I'm really not going to write this out as a full application, so I'll get rid of that program.cs file there. As usual, I need to add a reference to Entity Framework. So I'll do install package Entity Framework. Hitting the tab for completion, hit enter. And now we have Entity Framework part of the project. Okay, window, go away. There we go. All right, so next thing I need to do is come over to Solution Explorer, right-click on the project, add new item, and I'm once again going to go to Data and ADO.NET Entity Data Model. And this time I'm going to call this the SD model for sled dog model. All right, and that, as usual, fires off the Entity Data Model wizard. So here's where the model-first design takes a much different turn than the database-first design. So here within the Choose Model Contents page, I'm going to select the empty EF Designer model because I don't want to reverse engineer the model from the database. I want to start from scratch. Now, note the description here. Creates an empty model in the EF Designer, Entity Framework Designer, as a starting point for visually designing your model. Later, you can generate a database from your model. The classes your application will interact with are generated from the model. Okay, so that's the only configuration option. There's nothing else the wizard can do, so the next button is disabled, and all we can do is click on the Finish button. And there we have that nice, clean, blank slate. A little note about the Model Designer. Helps you visualize and design your entity data model. Create new entities in the model by dragging items from the toolbox. Add existing entities and relationships to this diagram by dragging them from the model browser. And I'll talk about the model browser later. Now, despite the message here, there's really two ways to create new entities in the model. As it says, I can come over here to the toolbox and I can drag these objects. Most of the time I'll be working with entities here, as well as creating associations. But the other way is that I can right-click this and select Add New, and this lists all of the valid Entity Framework objects that I can add at this point. So for example, notice that association and inheritance are disabled. The reason is that there are no entities in the model yet, so I can't create an association where there are no entities yet. Similar to inheritance, there's no entities to inherit from, so I can't use that option. Now, in general, between the two ways of adding objects, the toolbox or this pop-up menu, I tend to find that the option to add objects using the pop-up menu much more convenient and easier to use. Because when you add an object, you get an Add Entity dialog box that lets you define the more important attributes of each item. When you add an item from the toolbox, it appears on the designer with the default settings. You have to remember to go in and change those default settings. Okay, it's time to start adding items to the designer, starting with entities. And that's almost always where you're actually going to start. All right, so the first thing I want to add is the event entity. And I'll just right-click a little bit closer to the upper left corner here. So I'll add a new entity. And like I said, that opens up this Add Entity dialog box. First thing I'm going to do is change the name to Event. And notice that the dialog box, even as I'm typing, oops, actually I wanted Event. So the dialog box correctly pluralizes the name to events. And that's for the entity set, the group of objects, if there's a collection of them. Now I do want to create a key property. Again, that's like a primary key. But I want to give it a little bit more specific name and call it Event ID. Naming convention I tend to use. If you want to just use ID, you can tell from the context that it's an event ID, whatever works for you. And then I'm going to leave the default property type to int32. It's a surrogate primary key in essence, and so integers work well. All right, and there's our brand new event. No properties other than the entity key value, event ID, and it's ready now for customization, filling out with the additional scalar properties that are necessary in order to save the data that we need for our events. All right, now if I select Event ID and come over here to Properties, these are the properties that were set based on my selections. In particular, the type is int32. That was the default that I set. It by default is using the identity store generated pattern, but it can also be computed or none. But what this is going to do is this is going to follow the identity scheme of SQL Server databases, starting with a value of 1, incrementing by 1. All right, this is the entity key, so that is set to true. And nullable is set to false, primarily because it's an entity key and we need a value there. All right, so all of those settings are appropriate for primary keys. Again, equivalent to the primary key within a database table. All right, now I need to add scalar properties for the event entity. So with this property selected, the easiest way is to just hit the Enter key, and that enters a property or inserts a property right below the selected property. Now I could have also pressed the Insert key or use the Add New Scalar property option on the entity's pop-up context menu. Whatever works best for you. All right, this property is going to be called Name. It's the name of the event, so I'll type it in and hit Enter. Now if I go back over here to the Properties window, I may as well keep that open for now. You can see here the default properties that just creating the object gave me. So by default, a new property is a string, and then it has the facets which are set to none. So in this case, I want to change the max length to 75, because that's the maximum length of an event name. And so if I create an application that understands how to read these properties from an entity data object, then the user interface will automatically configure itself to limit the user's input to 75 characters. But because this is a model-first approach to entity framework, that's also going to set the maximum storage size in the database. Okay? It's not going to limit what I can directly put into the entity data object, but because I'm going to create the database from this model definition, that's going to be the size of that field. Nullable, I'm going to keep set to false because I need to have a value for name. And that's good for this property. So now I'm going to real quickly add a few more properties here. First up is event date. This, of course, needs to be a date time, so I'll change the type here. And I don't need to set any particular facets. Next, I'll add a sponsor. Just in case we have any sponsors for this particular event. I'll leave that set to string. I'll set the max length to 50. Nullable is true because we don't always have a sponsor, so I'm just double-clicking on the property to cycle through the different values. And we don't have to worry about default values or any other settings. All right, then one more is the location. And this will be a string. There's no max length. I'll set nullable because we don't always know what the location of a race is going to be when we create the event. But I am going to set the default value here because the scenario here is I'm creating this application for the Alaska Dog Mushers Association, which is the Sled Dog Sports Association here in Fairbanks, one of them anyway. And so most of the events are at Mushers Hall. Sometimes we have events down in North Pole, a city about 20 miles to the southeast of Fairbanks, and then various other places occasionally. But most of the time it's Mushers Hall. So this is going to pre-fill that data if I don't supply a value. So Mushers Hall is a location owned by ADMA. Okay, that's it for event. Next thing I need to do is add the race entity. So I'll add a new entity. This is going to be called race, and I'm going to change the key property to race ID and leave it as int32 as well. Need a few scalar properties for this, so I'm going to hit enter and add distance. So this is the distance of the race. So this is going to be a decimal value. And I'll leave nullable set to false because we need to know what the distance is. And then dog count. Again, remember this is the maximum dog count that is allowable for this particular race. Needs to be an integer. I'll use the most efficient one, which is int32, leaving that to false as well. So conceivably we could have a race where there's no maximum dogs, which almost never happens. And then finally I will enter trail. So this is going to have information about the trail that this race uses. All right, so that's the information about an individual race within this event. And then I'm going to add one more entity, and this is going to be called team. So this is going to record information about the entries for this race. I'll change that to team ID, and we're good there. All right, a few more properties. First thing is first name. So this obviously is going to be the name of the musher, and that'll be a string. I'll set a max length here of 20. I'm going to change this to fixed length because what that's going to do is rather than using a varchar, it's going to use a char. Okay? Again, somewhat gratuitously, just doing that to show you how these different properties work. Not necessarily that it's the right appropriate thing for a first name. And I'm going to leave nullable to false because we need to know the musher's name. All right, similarly, last name. String there as well. Max length is going to be 30. Last names tend to be a little bit longer. Fixed length here of true as well. And then a city, because we like to know where the mushers are coming from. And I'll leave that set to a string, max length of 50. And set nullable to true. Sometimes the mushers don't fill it out on their form, sometimes we don't know, whatever. So we don't always have a city name. And then similarly, we get mushers from all over the world. So we like to know where the country is. So that's, of course, a string, max length of 50. And also make that nullable. And then the final thing to do here is add dog count. In this case, this is the number of dogs that this team in this particular race ends up using. So once again, this needs to be an integer. So I'll set it to, oops, wrong way, int32. And I'm going to leave nullable to false because we always need that information.